Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Frank Forkin, Ipsos's Automotive Sector Client Leader. Frank, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. First, welcome everyone. This is actually our third WebEx in the last 2 or 3 months. We have some really great insights to share with you today. And I wanted to, so those of you who have been to some of the previous WebExes, we are going to touch on not only the most recent information around COVID, but in this presentation, we're also going to be focusing on our Mobility Navigator study and the first module, which includes information on autonomous and connected vehicles. So, Mike, if you can go to the next slide. One more. Okay. Throughout the presentation, I wanted to make sure that you guys understood where a lot of this information was coming from. So Ipsos is currently conducting several syndicated programs, ongoing trending reports from a global standpoint. So a lot of the information, actually the majority of the information that Mike Van Newkirk is going to be presenting is coming from a Gen Pop trend survey that we're doing in 11 countries. And so we call that the Essentials product. So when you see Mike's information, the sourcing is coming from a particular study. Then John Kaiser will be focusing more on the results from our Mobility Navigator, which used to be called the Automotive Navigator, and in particular the results of Module 1, which I mentioned include not only the autonomous and connectivity type questions, but this year we added several COVID-related questions. Mike, if you go to the next slide. So why this was important, we already had this survey in place where we were doing 3 waves throughout the year. Our subscribers said, hey, do you mind if you could add a few questions around COVID so that we could track changes throughout the year? In fact, we actually created what we called a Module 0, which was done, I think, in April to kind of develop a baseline. And so then we'll have that baseline plus 3 additional data points throughout this year to see how these questions are changing. And a lot of what Mike and John will be talking about are the changes from July through from April. So I think you'll find that really interesting. So wanted to make sure you guys were aware of the product and where the information comes from. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. And Mike, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Frank. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Frank mentioned, some of the early slides I'm going to share with you is really general information from our Essentials survey, which is done across a number of countries. But I'm going to be focusing really on U.S. consumers and how COVID is impacting them. And then a little later, I'll kind of go a little deeper into how COVID is impacting automotive behaviors or automotive attitudes. So we've seen this slide before, and this is really a look at how people are dealing with COVID, or in essence, how threatened they are. So what we're looking at is how the percent of people who indicate that they're either feeling highly threatened or very highly threatened by the pandemic or by COVID-19. And we haven't seen a whole lot of movement since we first asked this question back in April. We're up a few points overall as Americans. We're at 34% feeling a sort of a high level of threat, which is pretty stable. And for the most part, we're seeing a lot of stability in the different ways to break the data. So among the gender, we did see a bit of a shift up with males. We're up to 38% there, where females stayed consistent at 31. And then the lower age groups, younger people, 18 to 34, that's up a few points, 4 percentage points to 35. The middle age group in the span is up a bit too, 5 points to 36. And interestingly, older consumers, older Americans actually have gone down a bit by 2 points. Now, kind of staying on that same lens, but looking at this by where you live, and we shared this with you in the past as well, it's still urban dwellers who are feeling the most threat. And it makes sense. They're in highly populated areas. They're in close proximity to each other. A lot of their modes of getting around have been reduced or shut down. And so it is definitely a little more impactful on urban dwellers. We have seen a bit of a small shift in positioning of rural and suburbanites. I think originally suburbans were a little lower, but we found that we still have a little more, let's call it close proximity when we have to go to grocery stores or other essential services. Rural consumers tend to be very self-dependent, and so they're naturally social distanced and isolated, and so for that reason, they're the least amount of threatened. So this next question is a bit new. And we started asking this about 6 weeks ago, and there's a few of them that I'm going to share with you. But this one is specific to asking Americans to describe where they feel they are with regard to the pandemic. So what phase are you within? And it's everything from, hey, it hasn't reached my area yet, to, I'm dealing with the restrictions and adapting to them and sort of figuring out how we sort of exist or do things in those conditions, to things are loosening up, and even a small percentage who feel that the pandemic is behind them. And along with those different phases are the actions we take as people. So if we're not feeling like the pandemic is there yet, obviously there's no change to what we do. But as you move from left to right, it goes from, hey, we're stockpiling, we're preparing, to I'm establishing new routines because I'm dealing with restrictions, I'm settling in, and then it starts moving down to things may be loosening up. So I'm awaiting that, to actually seeing restrictions being lifted, and I can start doing things that I had done before. And in the final phase, it's more moving on with my life, the new normal, as we've often heard it referred to. But in the bottom, you can see how things have shifted over that time. And I want to point out three in particular that are standing out. So while most of us are kind of feeling we're in that adapting to new restrictions or just sort of settling into those restrictions, we not too many weeks ago, a month and a half ago, we had more Americans feeling like we're on the verge of lifting those restrictions. In fact, that was up to 17%. And since then, what we've seen is that that's reduced the most. 13 points less than it was previous, and it's shifted into two directions. 7 points have moved toward those restrictions actually have been lifted, and I'm now starting to do things that I once wasn't able to, but we've also seen a shift back toward possible new restrictions being put in place. And this is where we're seeing COVID in local areas sort of re-emerging, and so restrictions are going up again. Another one of the new questions that we added about a month and a half ago was, how frustrated are we feeling? How impacted are we personally by COVID and the restrictions that we have to live with? And most of us fall right in the center. We have sort of a really balanced sort of spread here, where very few people feel that it's really not impactful at all. And that may be the areas where it's more rural, or it's maybe states that didn't really impose restrictions, never shut down, all the way up to, I find this completely intolerable. And so you can see through the images of these emotions, the bulk of us are sort of in the center between 2, 3, and 4, with most of us in that middle. And this has been fairly stable over time, right? Dealing with restrictions and the change to the way we do things is something we've had to adapt to, but with that comes some frustration because we are unable to just do things how we normally would. And the last new question I wanted to share with you was about how we feel about the future, what level of uncertainty we have about how things will be when this is all behind us. And for the most part, we're kind of stuck in the middle again, right? We either have some uncertainty or we feel there's a lot of uncertainty. That's where most Americans are sitting. And again, this has been relatively stable over the last 6 weeks. Very few people feeling that they have no uncertainty, like we're confident what's going to be and how things will move forward, which is, that's where we would hope to be. And we have a small percentage, 10%, that feel that they are literally stuck, and very high levels of despair associated with that. So these three questions actually are part of a model that our colleagues at Ipsos, out of groups called Strategy 3, which is our general consulting group within Ipsos, and our behavioral science team have developed, and it's called the Ipsos Pandemic Adaptability Continuum. And it's really a model that looks at the emotional journey that consumers are on, and where we're at along that journey. So you kind of see it depicted there to the right, this image. And this data that you're seeing here is illustrative. So this is not actual data. I'm going to show you data in a moment. But I wanted to give you a sense of how this, let's call it model or this journey is structured. It's really based on all that work that Frank shared with you at the beginning, that circle of research that's happening across the globe. And we're looking at markets where the pandemic is just emerging or lockdowns are already in place and restrictions are in place to slow the spread of COVID, or restrictions and the lockdowns are being lifted and economies are starting to reopen. And you can see that those little gaps or those phases, if you will, there's 10 of them, and they are varying lengths, right? Some last longer, some are brief, and this is how we're laying out this model over time. And within that time frame, we're tracking emotions. So up higher is more positive, down low is more negative, and we can look to see how people feel during the various stages. Now, to kind of zoom in a bit on that, I wanted to share with you sort of more of a balanced look at this and what we call the initial phases, which is uncertainty, preparation, adjustment, acclimation, and enduring. And then what we would call the future phases, which is the anticipation of restrictions being removed, the exploration of what that's like, recalibrating the way we do things, and then rebuilding and ultimately settling in. So the first set of section below that really defines the events and the environments that are defining each of those phases. Along with that are those emotions I was talking about, whether they're high or low, or positive or negative, that happen at each one of those time points. So during uncertainty, for instance, we actually were dealing with things in a more humorous way because we didn't really understand. We didn't have all the information. We weren't sure. So, sometimes we were defiant or just joking about it. But as we move through this phase or these stages, we'll see more negative emotions. And then ultimately, as we move into the latter parts of the phases, we'll see more positive emotions again. So looking at Americans and how we're sort of placing among this this continuum or this journey, and thinking back to those three questions, those new questions that I shared with you, which are all inputs into this. This is kind of how we're currently laying out as of just a few days ago, where most Americans are sort of in this, still in the initial phases, and we're in this sort of acclimation. So we're getting used to the restrictions that are in place, and we're kind of dealing with it, right? Or we're still in the adjustment period where we're trying to figure out how are we going to do the things that we need to do. Preparation is really more about things are coming, things are going to happen, so I'm preparing for it. And that's the bulk of us. That's in fact 3/4 of Americans kind of fall into that phase. The remaining quarter are more feeling they're in the future phases, but at much smaller percentages. But if we roll back 6 weeks ago, there's been some decent shifts in those sort of where people fall within those phases. We've kind of fallen back. So if you look at anticipation, we're actually 9 points lower than we were in mid-June. We were up to 12% of Americans feeling they were in anticipation. Again, that's that stage where things are going to be lifted, and we're anticipating that we're going to be able to do more things. So there's this sort of excitement that was happening at that time. Or some were already recalibrating, right? They're starting to adjust to doing things a little differently. That's down 7 points. It was at 14 back in mid-June. And that has shifted backwards, back from future phase to initial phases into more acclimation, adjustment, and preparation. So this is an indication of what we were seeing where things had opened briefly or were anticipated open, and then they funneled backwards because of resurgent, because the need to go back to masking up and making sure that we were social distancing and restricting the amount of businesses that could be open. And just to give you sort of context, you see I've brought in some of those activities that were happening in each of those sort of major shifting phases. Okay, we're going to revisit this model when John speaks a little later, because he's going to look at it from an automotive consumer perspective. Again, what I'm sharing with you now is general American consumers. Okay, all right, kind of using the same data, but we're going to look at automotive impacts here. And we've shared this data with you before, but I think it's always good to kind of level set. And we looked at among people who had employment, whether it's full or part-time, what was their predominant choice for transportation? And in the United States, it's driving a vehicle. 2/3 of the consumers said that's the main way I get around to commute to work or to get around for my work. But if you're an urban dweller, you were using more personal transportation, riding a bike or walking, or public transportation, whether it was bus or rail, taxis, rideshare, so on and so forth. But they too were still predominantly 57% driving a vehicle. So this is obviously, and we all know this, a very driver's market. And so one of the things we asked, and I wanted to check in again on, was what are your plans when we get out of COVID and out of the restrictions? How are you going to proceed using some of those transportation modes that you were using in the past? And looking at vehicles, again, that was sort of where we are predominantly. About 2/3 of Americans that have driven to work in the past or have been using a vehicle as their primary mode are going to go back to that immediately, with a smaller percentage, 21%, saying, I'm going to give it a little wait and see, make sure it's safe, and then I'll probably go back to driving. And only 13% are saying, I'm going to delay that or maybe even stop driving altogether. And part of this may be because they can work from home more, or they've found other ways and they don't need to drive. But again, the shift is primarily around I'm going to drive. And there has been a little bit of movement, but very small amounts. The bigger issue is for ride sharing and public transportation, where we're seeing predominantly people are considering stopping use, or even, or delaying for a longer period, the amount that I will do ride sharing or use public transportation. And we've talked about this in some past webinars, the concern over how safe is it, that environment, and I can control the environment with my vehicle. And so that becomes a little more easy to go back to, where ride sharing and public transportation has a little more inherent risk from a consumer's perspective. The big concern, though, is the amount of shift that we're seeing from wait to see to delay or stop, which again is difficult if you're focusing on those particular transportation modes. It's something that consumers that depend on those are struggling with. How am I going to move forward? When we ask people, is your commute to work going to change? About half of the people said no, it's going to be pretty much the same as it was, right? I'll do it the same way. And then 13% said, I'm not sure, but a third said, yeah, it's going to change. It's not going to be the same as it was before. And when you look at that change, about a quarter of the folks says, I'm going to work from home more. So this is an option that many Americans are finding, and many companies are finding is viable, that we're able to work remotely and from home. And for that reason, it may become more acceptable, more of a norm. There's actually even some benefits that companies are finding in terms of costs associated with that. But a larger proportion, almost half of the consumers that said, yeah, my commute is going to change, feel that they're going to have to drive to work more often. So again, we're seeing this shift and this dependency and really this opportunity for automotive to be a transportation choice, even more so than it was in the past, and partly because it's something that I as a consumer can control. So that's a quick sort of look in at what's happening with American consumers and how is COVID impacting us from a general sense and even down to an automotive. I'm going to turn the conversation now over to John to share with you a little more around these same topics and how COVID is impacting that. So John, it's yours.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Hopefully you can hear me okay, everybody. Sounds like we can, so that's good. So now I'll just, like Mike alluded to, is focus on the new vehicle angle, what we got right out of our Mobility Navigator module to get some more insights. And in particular, what we have is a robust sample, right? What we have worked with is we have a total of 22,000 completes that we're able to leverage for our research from this module. We're able to analyze across a variety of different subgroups of our different countries. And then this year we did add India, plus added our COVID impact questions to the module. our sample is representative within each country across age, gender, residence, location, and life stage. And so, of course, our key insights will be from the fact that they are vehicle owners, which is important. Ultimately, what we'll highlight of this deeper insight is this information as on what you can get from this module, and then I'll highlight a couple of key insights from a US perspective for our discussion today. So just know I am just scratching the surface on what's possible, but I will be showcasing a variety of things as it relates to, first, generically, how is transportation impacted? I will leverage the model that Mike introduced as the pandemic adaptability continuum from our team here at Ipsos, so you can see how that's impacting the vehicle owners, and then ultimately get into the acceptance of autonomous and our connected car features. What's the impact of COVID onto their perceptions and the consumer's willingness to adopt these features, and then give some perspective of why. Why do we think that is happening as we go forward through 2020? So first off, let's dig into the data and what are we seeing? We wanted to understand is the impact of transportation usage as relates to COVID. So we first asked the question of what are consumers utilizing today? What did they do before COVID specifically? We ground them, and then we asked, since COVID has happened at the end of June when we collected this data for the US, how has their usage of these different transportation options changed? And what we are seeing and observed is that most of the change has happened as a result is to the non-fee transportation. That's where we're seeing most of the increased usage happening versus the fee-based. We're not seeing as much of that increased usage, and that's to be expected based on what's transpired with the pandemic and limiting people's usage happening in the market specifically. But what we want to see is and understand is how did that compare directly to when we did the work in April? How did that shift transpire? And ultimately what we are seeing is those owners have seen further gains in their usage of that non-fee transportation. That's where we see the biggest gains. We're seeing in walking and biking and motorcycle usage the most, whereas the non-fee continues to be, I guess you could say, diminished. That usage hasn't shifted that much even over the last couple of months, even though that we have seen the US market, I guess you could say, open up a little bit. That change hasn't happened as a result. And ultimately, it's a matter of understanding this in further detail and like, what can we be doing about it specifically? We then now, if we take a look at the vehicle intention of these new car owners, what are we observing? What we have seen in the US is about 40% before COVID of these vehicle owners are intending to get a vehicle the next 18 months. And then we wanted to understand is after COVID, and understand of the current conditions today, what would happen. And we do see a slight decline in the percent of these consumers saying they would be interested in buying again in the next 18 months. So it's just a minor decline. That's on par as what we saw in China. But we do see in both Europe as well as Brazil, there's a little bit more, I guess you could say, pessimism, if you will, and their interest in the consumer demand for vehicles. If we counter this stated behavior to vehicle sales of what we've seen in the US, we know there was sharp declines in March and April because of the closures, but it appears, assuming that the surge could be maintained here in the US for the second half of the year, that there still will be demand amongst those US consumers in the market. So we'll continue to monitor that throughout the year. And then it's a matter of trying to understand, now focus just in the US, looking at reasons why people, these consumers, be willing to purchase, a vehicle again, maintaining or increasing it. What is the main primary reason? And we're seeing it is safety is that primary reason for consumers. The second reason, it's this idea of not letting the pandemic impact their vehicle plans. Which is interesting. This is a little bit of a shift of what we saw from April. We do see that gain some steam of this idea of at least just sticking to what they've done. They want to have their vehicle, and we do see a decline in their expectation of getting a great deal. That's interesting, as well as perhaps a little bit of realism that they're not necessarily just expecting a fantastic price in the market. Maybe that can't continue, but rather, being a little bit more realistic. And then, as if we go back to that IPAC model that we've developed, we wanted to look now at these owners and how do they behave. And you'll see a slight difference from what Mike shared. And what we're seeing is more of a pure split of the U.S. vehicle owners. About 57% are at those early stages, in particular at the acclimation. We see 27% of the consumers there. But in the future state, what we're seeing is 19% are at the recalibration, which indicates is that there's this, I guess you could just say, dichotomy or a split of those U.S. consumers. And you can understand is, what could be driving this? This shows that at least understanding of the consumer mindset is going to be important as we go forward through this recovery. And then if, as I shared in the U.S. data, is that 43% are at that future state, 57 are at that initial state in the market. And how does that compare to other regions? And what is surprising is that considering that China and Europe are ahead of us in the recovery, they don't have as great as a percentage of that late stage or that future stage, if you will. And that to us is a bit surprising. Again, perhaps the U.S. mindset is not necessarily understanding of what's happening in the market, and that we would want to continue to monitor this as we go throughout 2020 so that we can understand where they're at and adapt messages accordingly. But ultimately, we also see is that Brazil is not surprising because of their also resurgence of cases of having 88% at this initial stage. We would expect that. But again, we'll continue to monitor that so we understand the implications of it. And then if we take a deeper dive into this, the U.S. consumer, again, looking at the split of the initial stage people versus the future stage people and trying to understand what is driving these consumers' interest in getting a vehicle and to maintain their purchase of a vehicle, what we are seeing is that initial stage, it is just about safety. We're seeing 44%, that's their primary reason of getting a vehicle. But when we look at the late stage or the future stage people, what is driving them? It's this idea of not letting the outbreak impact their vehicle plans. And what's interesting about that is this idea of they just kind of want to move on. They're a little bit more defiant with their selection. Safety is still important to them, but it's just not the primary reason. So the idea is to make sure that you understand this mindset, so when you are communicating with the consumers in the marketplace, that you can help them through that sales process. So the idea is if you're at the dealer and you're understanding what is the mindset of that consumer, you know what to be touting and to be able to communicate, whether it's the typical functionality features of the vehicle and or if it's about the idea of the safety of that vehicle to be able to protect them. Having that is certainly going to be beneficial. And then we also pose some questions to further understand the consumer mindset and to see if there's how their perceptions are in the marketplace relative to April. So this idea of COVID relative to the manufacturer's perceptions, dealer sales, and service. And what we've seen for the most part, consumers remain concerned. 8 out of 10 are going to take COVID precautions in place. That's still maintaining, even since April, that's maintained. But when we look at the perceptions of auto manufacturers and their perceptions of, are they doing enough to help in the pandemic? We see an improvement, see 10 points improvement, but only 4 in 10 perceive that they've done enough in the market. Then when we can look at dealer sales versus service, what we see is just 50% of consumers are in agreement with this idea that they understand how they can buy a vehicle. And that there are precautions being taken in place to help protect them of their safety. And then for service, again, we've seen improvements since April, but this idea of that the dealer's taken the steps to ensure of their safety and they've communicated how the vehicle can be serviced in market. We would say that while that's great that there's improvement, but there's more work to be done. There should be no doubt in the mind of the consumer that they should know that they're going to be protected if they go to the dealer. There's going to be precautions in place, and they should be able to know essentially that it's going to be safe to be able to purchase a vehicle, or a vehicle is in for service specifically. And then we also dug in and to try to understand of these consumers and their desire to do things online. And what we've learned is this idea of doing things online is something that they want. They want to be able to get insurance. They wanted to be able to get their software updated in the vehicle, and specifically 2/3 want to be able to purchase a vehicle online. And they're very willing to be communicating with the salesperson with the video chat. So that's something that it's a matter of activating on and making sure that you are moving forward with your continued plans. We know, like we saw the improvement on communicating from the dealer, that you can do these things. It's just going to be important to continue and invest in the development of a virtual or online platform to be able to purchase a vehicle. It should be easy, it should be consistent, it should be streamlined for consumers to be able to do that, and they should understand what it is. Particularly if there is a continued resurgence in the US market, you're going to want to bring the dealership to the consumer and not just expect that consumers will come to the dealership. So that'll be important as we navigate through the remainder of 2020. And then if we continue on and go a little bit deeper, let's try to understand what's the impact of all this relative to autonomous and connected car features. And what we have seen is, first off, we wanted to level set consumers' mindset. So because autonomous, it can mean a lot of different things to different users. So we wanted to level set and provide them a definition so that we knew what we were referencing and what we were talking about. And so what we have said is that the autonomous mode can handle all road conditions. It can enable the driver to take back control at any time. So definitely not a level 5 level of autonomous, but rather, I guess you could say level 3, level 4, where it can be handling most, if not all, road conditions for them to be able to utilize this functionality. And so when we asked them their interest level, we wanted to see is what's the, oh, excuse me, sorry, a little sensitive. So now I'm looking at and comparing between 2019 and 2020. Ultimately, what is the level of interest and how has that changed? And what we are seeing is overall, the level of interest in autonomous has maintained despite COVID-19. We've seen reports that this idea that maybe the autonomous won't be as interesting. We are seeing from a consumer perspective, they're just as interested. I understand perhaps investment in the industry. This might, let's say, not be top of the list for auto manufacturers, but nevertheless, there is still interest across regions, specifically US, and we are seeing increased interest in China and Brazil. And you might ask, well, why is that? We have tracked this over the last few years, and we have observed that both in China and Brazil, in particular, are higher level acceptance of new technologies, wanting to try things out. So that's more or less has maintained despite COVID as well. But this is what we are observing, is that there's still that consumer interest. And then when we particularly find some interesting information is this growth of experience. That growth is defined as people who have driven or ridden in the vehicle, and that is consistently grown across their key regions. And what we've seen in the market, there's more awareness, there's more examples of this in the marketplace, such as like the Tesla's Autopilot. You could also reference the Cadillac Super Cruise. And plus, we also think of from a consumer standpoint with some of the ADAS functionality from the different manufacturers that, like the Subaru EyeSight, Toyota Safety Sense, all of these packages move towards autonomous. And so having that exposure, that awareness, we are seeing people trying it, they're experiencing it, and that's actually what we would say is having an impact. And then what we've observed here in the US, we looked at those people who have experienced it, driven or ridden in a semi-autonomous vehicle versus those who haven't experienced, and what is the level of interest in autonomous. And we see something very, very interesting. 3x level of interest if they've only been exposed and had some level of experience. That's very interesting to be able to see and be able to identify. If you have the opportunity to try it, see what those limitations are of the functionality, then you're going to have expressed a little bit more interest in the proposition. So there is some upside, if you will, if we can generate some more increased usage or I should increased trial in the market. And then if the downside, or the one thing that's interesting, it just hasn't necessarily converted to purchase consideration. We're seeing that's maintaining, it's relatively flat here for the US year over year between 2019 and 2020 when we measured it. And so then the question is why is that? What is holding consumers' perceptions back? Why aren't they gravitating more to be willing to purchase it? And what we've seen is, and we've identified some attributes to have them respond to and get a sense of agreeability. And so we looked at, of those considerers, what are the things that they're most agreeable about? What are the things that they identify? And what we see, the things that are floating to the top that they have indicated of that they're most interested, is this idea of what the promise of autonomous is, this idea of it's more comfortable, it's more relaxing driving experience. They also identify that autonomous is good in certain situations, not necessarily all, but this idea of convenience is floating to the top for these consumers of those who would be considering it, which is very much, it's interesting, it illustrates it's those who are willing to take a chance, right, and have bought into what the proposition is. But we've also looked in a little deeper of these intenders of autonomous to try to understand, well, how often would they use the autonomous mode? Are they expecting to use it all the time? We identified, and we have this data within our full report, 67% of the time is what these considerers are expecting to use the autonomous mode. So things such as commuting, such as long driving experiences, that's where they would want to be utilizing it. We also asked is, what do they want to do when they are in autonomous mode? We've seen 40% are indicating that they would want to still stay focused on the road, right? Which is encouraging to see. But we also see another 40% saying, well, they just want to look outside, enjoy the scenery. Another 39% said they would want to talk to their passengers, those people in the vehicle while they're going through their drive. And then we also revealed that even those in Japan have indicated that they would plan to sleep. And we know there's very long commutes in Japan, and this idea of taking advantage or optimizing your commute time by napping is certainly going to be beneficial. So a variety of different reasons of why people would want to use it, of these people who would be considerers. But then we dug in to try to understand, well, what's preventing of the non-considerers? What's floating to the top? What's the main concern? And it's not too surprising, and what we are seeing is a mix of, people they prefer driving. But another is this idea of safety. Safety is very crucial for them. 9 out of 10 are saying it's not perceived to be safe for themselves and or the person on the street, somebody else, another vehicle or even pedestrian for that matter. So this idea of, safety is like a real barrier for these consumers, and that's a key hurdle to overcome and to broaden out the appeal of autonomous. So despite this, we also asked, just of these consumers, what would you prefer? Assuming there's no price premium, what would consumers desire? And we presented this as a fully autonomous. Think of level 5, no steering wheel, no pedals, like it's full autonomous. Semi-autonomous, where it could be utilized in some occasions, not all occasions, versus just the manually driven. And we're actually seeing something interesting here in this idea of consumers are accepting of it. We're seeing a growth in acceptance of semi-autonomous vehicle, 4 points versus 2019, where the drop off on just manually driven. We are seeing it's relatively flat for the fully autonomous, but it just shows that there's still interest there. It's this idea, if you can get over this key hurdle of to broaden it further amongst the non-considerers, is going to get some additional wins, get some incrementality. So we dug in and we try to understand is, what does that likely autonomous considerer look like? What is their profile? We are seeing for the most part, it is that early adopter profile, this idea of it being younger, skewing male, have a longer commute, they live in urban areas, but we see something that pops here, this idea they trust the technology of ADAS features. They value safety. They, of course, they also indicate they're early adopter, digital, so they're adopting of new things. This isn't too surprising. You would expect this, but it's this idea of trying to broaden it. How do you speak to that next audience in particular? And so we would say one way to do it is with the connected car functionality. As consumers can get more comfortable with autonomous-like feature and functionality, that's through these advancements in these connected car features, ADAS features in particular. So these are the 14 features we evaluated in our module. We did have a few repeat from 2019, but we added a fair amount of incremental ones to get an idea of what is that priority, what are most consumers interested in, what's transpiring, so we can understand and help prioritize in collective investment in the market. And what we have observed is, I guess you could say, an ability to scorecard, ability to rank, ability to cut this data a number of different ways. We can look at it in total, you can look at it by country, you can look at it by key demographic groups, and then you can profile out each of these features. I can't get into all of the detail because it's pretty immense, but we have the ability to look at ultimately interest, willingness to pay, awareness of the feature, even usage of a feature and functionality. We do key scorecarding and indexing across countries to help normalize scale use. So there's rich information as part of our reporting, but like I said, we can't go into all of this detail today, but I can highlight what we have learned from the US market. So I have the 14 features here. I've charted it by interest level, by willingness to pay. And what we have observed here is this idea of what's floating to the top. And we see the top 3 features that are coming to the top, just a clear safety benefit is coming through. Accident avoidance, emergency service, and advanced driver assist system. That's clearly what's differentiating these features from the rest. And so we would say, as you would break down the rest, if we can enhance these further, we can then increase the willingness and acceptability of these features if we had the safety benefit being clear so that it can appeal to a broader group of people. This is, we can learn from history, we can learn from our past, and, we've seen similar concerns when, adaptive cruise control came out. Once people got used to it, used it, they had proof that it works, they began to trust it. They began to use it in more occasions. They where appropriately use it. So with these new features, if we can explain the clear safety benefit on any of the features you may be investing in, as well, if it has rooted in that core safety benefit, and then they can get some element of trial and some type of experience with it, then they can become growing to trust it and know when to use it, when not to use it, and be able to utilize that in the car. And ultimately, what we would say is graduate it to becoming a must-have feature. Speak of safety, one thing I would say is this idea of COVID. What has COVID done as it relates to safety? And this idea of vehicle safety has grown in importance. Now, not only are we talking about crash prevention, personal security, its safe environment is becoming an important thing. And so if we can root, again, these connected car ADAS features and communicate about, beyond convenience, but rather talking about the safety benefit and communications, that will further enhance its appeal and further enhance the consumer's willingness to try them and being able to get that experience. And we would say that that's a critical step, a critical barrier. This idea of getting the trial, how do you get that trial is and create that increased interest by the safety benefit. And so some of our recap of our learning what have we learned? And so we're saying the autonomous appeal it's maintaining despite COVID-19, but to broaden that adoption, it's about trial. This exposure experience will enable the consumer to trust the technology. So we would say focus on the safety benefits of these new connected car and ADAS features to get that trial for the masses or broadening it. And of course, we would say communicating the control, that the driver is in control, where they can engage or disengage it at will, wherever they would particularly, where they deem necessary, right? And so having those key tenets being communicated as relates to these features, we would say will definitely broaden its appeal and broaden its trial and utilization. So then I would say as a recap, it's a little sensitive, there we go. Go back to what some of the things that Mike said. We need to understand that what we would say is the consumer mindset. Understand it from our Ipsos pandemic adaptability continuum, or the IPAC, that result of COVID. We have key learning. We then learned about what's the view from the owner's perspective from the US. We, understanding where their mindset is. We need to monitor that of their transportation usage, on what they will be doing for vehicle adoption. We are seeing it's being maintained. So that's definitely an important context to know as we evolve through 2020. We also have seen it, like I just said, with the autonomous appeal is there. It's just trial and safety positioning is key. And so with just these few, key insights, we have many more insights that can be gleaned from this with what we say from a full subscription. So you can look at the different regions, you can look at different data cuts. There's quite a bit of learning that can be had. There's key additional data points, what we would say as relates to COVID through 2020, as we try to manage through this transition of the pandemic. But then there's also, we have our electrification module later in the year, and then our shared mobility. And lastly, I would say, we have pricing information out there. It's meant to be affordable just to give you access to the data. But there's also, we would say, there's activation workshops that are even available. And we're happy to partner with you, and hopefully we could potentially work with you. Just reach out to any one of us. We'd be more than happy to help you and indicate what can we do with you based off of whatever your needs are. So with that, I would hand it over to Frank and to Mike, and answer any questions that may have came up. I don't know why he keeps doing that.
John, it's great job. You guys actually 1:48, just 3 minutes over. I was betting on that it would be a little longer, so good job on that. Okay. So we don't have.
Anyway, there you go. Sorry.
We don't really have any time for questions, and those who have submitted questions, we'll actually address them offline. I encourage people that didn't actually submit a question to either call any of us in this part of the seminar, or if you have an account executive that you work with, we'd certainly go through them as well. So again, I wanted to thank you guys for your time. We will do our next module. John, what month is that coming out? The electrification, so module 2?
That will be coming out in August.
Okay, so in August, we'll have another read.
No, let me clarify. We're fielding in August, but we'll read it in September. My apologies.
Okay, so report will be in September. We'll have another one of these. Hopefully these sessions are insightful for you. And again, appreciate the time, and we'll talk to you guys in a couple of months. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank and John and Mike, for today's really interesting presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, as Frank said, we'll do so by email, and you will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. Additionally, you can reference the handout section in your event console for more about our automotive research solutions. And of course, as Frank said, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you, so please reach out to us. That now concludes today's Ipsos webinar. Have a wonderful day.